It's interesting, the other thing people do with twins is they really want to compare and contrast. So as a child, everybody wants to say, does your sister do that better or do you?
Oh, no.
And I always remember thinking it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't, every success she has shouldn't be my failure, right?
Yeah.
And so I remember even as a little kid thinking, isn't it all right if I'm proud of her for doing something?
Yeah.
Welcome to Evening Rounds, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes in medicine. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Tammy Thomas, Dean of the School of Medicine at Loma Linda University. Dr. Thomas not only works to advance medical training here on campus, but also travels the world, helping to equip and educate the next generation of physicians. She sees the world with a photographer's eye and shares how being inspired is as important as inspiring others. If you like what you hear on tonight's podcast, please subscribe. Well, Tammy, it's odd calling you Tammy, Dr. Thomas, but it's great to have you here tonight on our Evening Rounds podcast.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
I have a really, really important question for you. What was the last photograph you took, and why did you choose to take that picture?
Last photograph on my regular camera was in Rwanda. And it was the sunset over the hills. So I chose to take it because it was a beautiful shot. Last photograph on my phone was a hummingbird in the canyon.
I can tell you're a real photographer because you have your real camera and your phone camera, and they're two very different things for you.
They're very different things.
I'm thinking about a branding opportunity for our Evening Rounds podcast. That Rwanda photograph may be spectacular for us.
Yeah. What were you doing in Rwanda?
I was working with a new medical school that just got started at one of the Adventist University of Central Africa. They have been working for a number of years to get started and have 34 new medical students that just started. So it was quite spectacular. They had a white coat ceremony for their students. They have students from 9 different countries. And it's kind of one of those fun things because they teach in English, but coming from 9 countries, everybody's English is a little bit different.
Oh, how unique.
So you think, it's in Africa, but it's actually really culturally diverse from all those different countries. So it was inspiring. It's so nice to see them be able to get it off the ground. And you look and think about everything you do every day and all of the busyness that you think you have, and then you go somewhere like that and you watch all they have to do with so many less people and resources. It's kind of humbling, and it's also inspiring.
So you're dean of the School of Medicine, and you're executive vice president of medical affairs. In our organization, that puts you right up at the top. When you were 6 or 7 years old, what was Tammy thinking she was going to do with her life, and how did your parents influence you growing up?
Ooh, several really good questions in there. I'll start with my parents. My parents are both teachers, and my mother actually was an English major and interested in journalism. And her dream would have been to be a sportscaster, sports journalist, because she is the best sports trivia person I know.
I love that.
That's
but
awesome.
It really wasn't. It wasn't even a possibility. So she became a teacher. My father's a teacher, and so I think that is the idea of being told all along, 1, to do your best, and 2, that you can do whatever you want to do if you choose to work towards that, right? So I think that the idea that any possibility was open was really always there. So I think that's nice.
What made you choose the specialty of emergency medicine?
I've told this story many times because students come in and say, why did you pick that specialty? But I liked everything. I loved seeing kids. I liked OB. orthopedics was more fun than you can imagine. The idea of fixing things and using physics and science to apply. It was all kinds of fun. I thought surgery was interesting and fascinating, and so I think that piece of really enjoying. I loved cardiology. I think that idea of being able to impact. So I think that piece probably played into it because it was something where you continued to see variety. I think variety is a little bit the spice of life. So the other piece I really appealed to me was the idea that when someone is kind of at their worst, that you're there to investigate it. And the idea that when Christ was here, he met people where they're at, whatever their needs would be, and whether they were at the top of society or at the bottom. And that piece of knowing that you were going to meet people's needs where they're at, no matter what. It didn't matter if they could pay or could pay or couldn't, that you actually could meet them there. The other piece I think I also like is I love the puzzle of figuring out what's going on. Kind of consider it like a little bit like a mystery that you keep pulling facts into and coming up with what's really happening.
You're an educator, so you took after your parents.
I said I'd never be a teacher.
Why?
Never say never.
Why?
Oh, it's funny. I think it's a kid thing, don't you?
Try to navigate your own path a little bit.
Exactly.
But you most definitely are an educator.
Yeah, you are now. Talk a little bit about, you touched on how competitive med school is and that village of support. Talk a little bit about how we've structured kind of our support for students.
It is something we've worked on really hard, for the last number of years. I think if you look across the nation and really across the world, it's funny. I have this conversation with all of our students at their orientation, and when I was in Africa, I had it with theirs. And I always say, if you feel like you're the one that doesn't belong, that everybody around here has it easy except for you, and that some moment someone's going to call you out and say, "You imposter there." Let's come back. And whenever I talk about that at orientation, I always have at least 3 or 4 students that come up and say, "I think you were talking to me."
Oh, wow.
And so the idea that everybody feels that way. Yeah. Everybody has that that feeling of inadequacy, or I want to accomplish that, but what if I can't? And then I have the same conversation in Africa, and I had 4 out of 34 students come up and say, "I think you were talking just to me."
Did you have that feeling when you were sitting in their chair?
I think some of this is a little bit generational. Yes, everybody has that feeling to a certain extent. Like, am I going to make it? Am I going to do well? Am I going to do as well as, how is this experience going to be? But I think there was a certain generational component previous to this that you kind of faked it until you made it, kind of thing. It's like there was something somewhat cultural that you didn't reveal all your vulnerabilities and warts, right? And I don't think a society today is that way. And people do reveal their vulnerability. And what I always say is that everybody has a bump. Yeah. And some people's bumps show, and some people's bumps don't. So the only thing you can do is worry about you.
I was scared out of my mind when I started medical school.
I can't even imagine how intimidating that must be.
I had taken just the basic 4 classes plus 1 physiology class. And I remember literally on orientation day, we're sitting in the room and Dr. Warner was talking with us, Dr. Lamberton. And I heard some of my classmates say, "Yeah, I've already taken all these classes," because they were talking about anatomy, physiology, embryology. I had to go look up what those words meant, embryology. And they were speaking about Latin names for plants and stuff. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm hosed.
Yeah.
And what it did instill me, Dr. Thomas and Tammy had mentioned the competitive fire. I was like, those guys aren't going to beat me.
Really?
So I studied like crazy. And I beat them, but that's a separate conversation. The point is,
I'm glad you worked that in. I'm glad.
No, but that imposter syndrome is real. Like, am I really fit for this? One of the things I wanted to come back to on that is I remember vividly sitting in classes and being with students and interfacing with them and chatting with them a bit. And with the pandemic and the transition to remote learning, and even conversations about, even well after the pandemic, concepts are figured out, that we are still going to have a remote learning component to our curriculum, maybe a significant component. How do you create an environment where that person doesn't even feel like more of an imposter, like they're sitting in their own room on Zoom? I'm concerned about that, because I certainly, without having the infrastructure support of my family there and so forth, I would have felt pretty hopeless, I think, sometimes.
It's really an interesting question from a standpoint of, I think, generally society, that idea of using technology in the most effective ways, taking the students away from the classroom and having them at least experience their lectures remotely. They did do, some mandatory labs in person, carefully with small groups and so forth. But you think, oh, this is better, this is more efficient, and we were joking a little bit about, what would happen if you were quarantined in your hotel room, and that on day 1 you'd be pretty motivated, and on day 10 you'd start looking a little rough, carrying a little less. And I think that we did see that experience. I mean, the idea that you would take your Zoom from your bed with your pajamas on seems surprising, but actually over time played itself out in reality.
Yeah.
And the idea that, oh, this is easier, it would be better to learn, and from a student standpoint, that if I don't have to go anywhere, I'll have this much more time to study. But the true reality is that the connections, the putting things together, the interactions, the questions in real life are stimulating. And you learn from more than just listening. You learn from talking. You learn from hearing others people's questions. You learn from your interactions with people. And when all's said and done, I think at least the evidence we have is it's not better. There are ways to plan and create a hybrid form of learning, but the idea of pulling away and losing interactions is not better learning.
It's so interesting you say that, because I think, I feel like medical school is all about those connections, and really like the relationships between, who your mentors become. And like you said, just even sometimes, maybe that's a fellow student. So that must be really interesting that we have this whole group now of students that are going through this pandemic time. How do you think that's going to impact medicine?
I think it will impact from a standpoint of, the way those interactions happen. I mean, what it really is about is connections and the ability to make connections. If you make connections face-to-face, if you make connections, more remotely, but at least being mindful that you have to make them. One of the things that we had implemented a couple years ago, which was invaluable in this process, is there's the concept out there called learning communities, where you assign people to different groups. We had put ours together as we changed our curriculum into what we call a life community, and we added curriculum to these communities. But essentially, it was like 10 people from the class assigned to a faculty member, and then there would be 10 people from the class above them, 10 people from the class above them, and the mentor doesn't grade them. They're a true person they can go to for advice that isn't going to give them a grade at any point in time. But and then we added a longitudinal curriculum called Christian Physician Formation, that we talked about what some people would call the soft stuff. What does it mean to be a professional? What does it mean to be well and healthy? How do I develop resilience over a time? How do I rectify, all of this suffering that I'm seeing in a world where a loving God is over them, and all those are hard questions.
Those are hard questions,
but they're questions that you want to be able to tackle and and talk about in a meaningful way in order to be in it for the long term. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when you're in your 20s, especially early 20s, I think in life it's a pretty idealistic time. I thought I was all grown up when I went to medical school.
I bet.
But you think about the kind of the black and white way you looked at the world. And then I, watched, the pain and suffering of humanity walk into the emergency department. And believe me, there's a lot of gray.
Yeah.
And so I think that piece of being able to have those, truly meaningful conversations and not be surprised by them later is valuable. So from that standpoint of wellness and having a meaningful way to have those conversations, I think it will help them later.
So it's kind of a group of people that you can ask the dumb questions and feel vulnerable around, or ask the intimate questions.
Mm-hmm. What about this? What about this?
Wow.
You took over from Dr. Hadley and the dean's role. You might never get the opportunity to choose when you do that. But certainly this would have been probably the scenario in which you wouldn't have chosen to do this, where every day was a new day. I am really interested in hearing your leadership philosophy because there's no question that you've been a leader for years here on campus, but with the transition to being Dean of the School of Medicine and Executive Vice President of Medical Affairs, that's an additional leadership role for sure. And with the pandemic and with lots of changes going on, I'm interested in learning about your secret sauce. What makes Dean Thomas so effective as a leader?
It's funny, in light of a lot of the other things that we've talked about, that idea of following anyone when you're dean or your chair or your division chief, mm-hmm. or all of those things, and everybody brings something really unique and special to the table, right? I thought Dr. Hadley was a very good dean. I loved the way he connected with people. I think, you think about the way that, like he did his selfies, and what better compliment can you give someone that you want to capture their image, right? I mean,
said like a true photographer. That is a beautiful way of putting that, though. That's so true.
But it's like you're important enough to, so I think it's really nice. And so I was thinking, well, I can do some things really well, and I won't be exactly the same as him. And one of a student that I had interviewed that had gone all the way through medical school, who's a resident, that I occasionally connect with, and I met him for lunch just to check in and see how he's doing. And so I was saying, yes, this is new territory that I'm entering, and I won't be this way. I won't be this way. And he stopped and said, why would you ever want to be like him? And I thought it was a great aha moment, because why would any of us ever want to be more than the best we can be? And so I think from that standpoint of walking, you don't have to walk in someone else's shoes. You just have to be comfortable and walk in yours.
Wow. I love your philosophy on that. As a leader, I've heard, not to discount anyone else at the table, but I've heard that emergency medicine physicians actually are in a lot of leadership positions because they kind of have to know a little bit of everything. Just like what you touched on, kind of knowing every specialty and knowing a little bit of everything. How do you think that your experience has really translated to your leadership positions now?
I think probably it's maybe less about knowing about everything than adapting, because the one danger probably in any specialty you can make, but particularly there, is locking in on what you think it is, and not leaving yourself room or flexibility to let new data come in.
Right.
And so you think, okay, I have this, and this. It's the perfect triad for X, and that's what it is. I'm going to treat that. And then as new data comes in and the patient changes, you actually truly have to be flexible in saying, this is where I think it's going, but does this extra piece add to that or take away from that? And I think that piece of leadership of not being so locked into what you think needs to happen.
Absolutely.
But actually being open to listening to say, that's where I'd like it to go. But, I have to be frank, that is not working.
Wow. It's a really interesting perspective.
Yes, that's why cardiologists can't do that, Kelsey.
I think cardiologists do that, actually.
Dicey topic.
I'm intrigued by what you see your role on campus as a mentor. I think you have the opportunity to mentor endless number of individuals. You certainly are a trailblazer in the world of medicine deans, and but I'm curious to see if you reflect on anyone being a sponsor for you. If you were going to look and say, yeah, there have been 2 or 3 individuals that have helped me get to where I am today. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about that.
It's a great question, and a lot has been talked about, particularly within medicine, about mentor sponsorship, coaching. The interesting piece is, if I was trying to think, when I was in medical school, there were maybe 25% of the class was women. Mm-hmm. So all of my jobs, I was the first one that they'd ever hired.
Oh, really?
So so my first jobs. And so that piece was interesting from the mentorship piece, right? Because they didn't always know quite what to do with you because you're different, right? So I think that that piece played an interesting part. So when an early job I had, there was a group of, people, there was about 6 of us that were all kind of at the same stage. And so, you could have all competed with each other and said, oh, I want to go do this. I, want to publish the most papers or, do the most whatever. But it wasn't like that. It was a group of people who helped each other. And so if you wrote a paper, you just sent it out to the other 5. And if they had time, they all gave you feedback on it and that piece. So it's probably something that has played into my philosophy of that if people around you do better, you do better.
Yeah.
So that piece, I think, was really remarkable. I think the idea of, I don't know how to do this, and put it out there to say, have any of you guys done this before? It made you kind of feel like you were discovering it together, and maybe having a true sponsor that actually showed you how to do it might have been more efficient, but it may not have been richer. I do really appreciate a couple chairs I had, and one in particular was Bill Whitlake, who was really thoughtful. He was a great planner. He many of his personal characteristics aren't what people would automatically think of when they think of emergency physicians, because people, I think, historically have thought it's this personality that goes into emergency, and but he was very thoughtful, a great planner. He sat down with us every year and asked us to make a plan for the next year, and then where do you want to go in the next couple of years, and that was useful for me, because you're not spinning, you're planning and moving forward. He also would talk about different things, and a couple of things. I have this innate sense of fairness. I think everything should be fair, and I would be like, "This isn't fair," and he, basically said, "Tammy, it isn't always fair," and, those kinds of things. So I can't even say how much I appreciated those conversations, the careful, systematic, caring way that he probably helped all of us develop. So I certainly would call him out.
Speaking of fairness, I want to go back to what you just said. I can't believe it wasn't that long ago that you were starting out in your career, and you were the first female in some of those positions. Talk about what that was like.
It's kind of interesting, the idea, and it's probably a good lesson in our overall general look at groups that are different, right? In that the first groups that are different actually don't necessarily want to be called out as different. You want to walk in and say, I have the skills I've developed that, the same as the people around me, and I want it to be treated that way. But in reality, you are different. And I think recognizing some of those things, owning them, and recognizing where it brings you advantage and where you could have some blind spots around it. I think, ways of communicating, men and women communicate differently.
Yep.
And so ways of communicating and saying, when does this really help me be more effective? And when do I need to stop and recognize that I need to communicate clearly in another way? It isn't one or the other. It's being able to translate it into, the language that you can get your point across, then you can, truly be effective and reach your goal. So I think it's maybe being fluent in more than one way of.
Yeah. Shifting gears for a moment, I do believe there's someone in this world that looks an awful lot like yourself.
I get that a lot.
So does telepathy exist? I mean, is this a legitimate thing? But tell me about your relationship with
I have a twin sister.
With your twin.
It's kind of funny because I get that where people will come up to me and say, I saw your twin. I saw someone that looked exactly like you. And I thought, oh, really? And they're talking about someone else.
Oh, really?
So I think I have a common face. But I do have a twin sister. So the common question people get is, what does it feel like to be a twin? And since you've never been anything other, it's a hard question to answer.
I can only imagine.
Well, when I wasn't a twin, it felt like this. For those 2 seconds, are you older or younger?
I'm older.
So there was a period of a couple minutes.
3.
So 3 minutes you were not a twin, right?
Yes,
so how was that experience compared?
It was brief, fleeting. But it is. I think it's a remarkable, totally fun thing and a gift. I think if you actually didn't get along with someone who knows you that well and probably knows all of your, vulnerabilities and Achilles heels and places to push your buttons, it would be tough. But it's been great. I mean, think about all of those times that you have new experiences in life, like going away to college or all of these things that you have. Underlying anxiety that you're not really showing, and you're thinking, what's this going to be like? You have somebody that experiences it at the same time.
Yeah, that must have been hard when you guys kind of separated.
It's interesting. The other thing people do with twins is they really want to compare and contrast. So, even like visually, if she comes to visit, people, they kind of just stare at you. They don't really talk. And so, look back and can I tell them apart? But as a child, everybody wants to say, does your sister do that better or do you?
Oh, no.
And I always remember thinking it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't, every success she has shouldn't be my failure, right?
Yeah.
And so I remember even as a little kid thinking, isn't it all right if I'm proud of her for doing something?
Yeah.
That's awesome. First off, one is you've described in several scenarios how important a sense of fairness is to you. We have not heard the adventuresome side of Tammy and the inspirational side. Who's an inspiration? So I would love to hear from you to say, what was the greatest? We know you were in Africa recently, but before that, when it wasn't sort of business related, what was your last adventure?
Let's see. I mean, I think that's part of why I like outdoor things. I like doing things. I grew up in the Northwest, so doing things outside, skiing, hiking, camping, motorcycle riding. All of those things we did growing up. So I think that piece I really like. It's probably why I like travel and seeing new things. The photography piece, I love the beauty of nature, and then the idea of capturing some kind of wonder to me is amazing. So one of my little mini goals was to be on every continent.
Wow. That's a pretty amazing goal.
They talk about climbing the highest peak on every continent, and I'm not a mountain climber, although I love hiking and so forth. But so I was a number of years ago sitting in Africa looking at Victoria Falls, and we were all sitting there, and I'm having tea, English tea, And I thought maybe this would be better and more civilized than trying to climb the highest peak on every continent. I think I'm going to have tea on every continent.
Oh, I love that. Have you done that?
I have to go back to Australia to have that experience, I think. But I did have it on Antarctica.
You had tea on Antarctica. Wow.
That's the name of your, that's the title of your memoir, I think, right there.
Well, that sounds cold, actually.
It sounds like a tough
The tea's
one.
warm.
Yeah, true.
Holding a teacup with mittens on or gloves on seems like a
exactly.
That's
good
awesome.
task.
That's awesome.
Wow.
Inspirational.
I do like to be inspired. I love a good project. I love a new, developing something new, which is, I think, what aligns me up with the job I have now is really fun because you are looking at, new things and developing something new. The inspiration, people are inspirational to me. I mean, watching someone grow and watching someone, develop a talent that is remarkable, that kind of leaves you in awe. I think that's inspirational. Like I think I mentioned to you, traveling and watching, I saw a new medical school that got started, and you see, all of these young people who from, different countries that haven't even, had an opportunity to be educated, or and they're sending their kids in, and you watching, and you think these people are going to go out to those countries with their new skills, and they're going to change the world.
You're blowing my mind right now because it's probably what makes you so effective in your role. I always think about being inspired by people who have already accomplished amazing things. Ted Williams, baseball player, or Barry Sanders, running back, or great political leaders. You're talking about inspiration from those who are at the beginning of their career and watching their development. That's a fascinating concept for me to get my head around.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you think about think about the people in your division and watching them come in with all these ideas and being able to see them focus and accomplish more than you could ever do by yourself, right?
Yeah. No, it's a wonderful way to think about an inspiring individual.
It really is.
So when you are meeting these inspirational folks and you meet with them for the first time or the 5th time or the 10th time, what are some words of wisdom that you give people with a ton of potential?
I think, one, you have to be patient. Most of us want something to change so quickly that people get discouraged a little too soon. So I think, when you're really trying to accomplish something, there's more than one way to do it. The idea that, going in through the front door doesn't work, then maybe you should, stop and regroup and, check the side door or the back door or whatever from the standpoint of, moving forward to accomplish something. The other is if we have goals that we're working towards, it's not about me. And often we get too caught up in the, what do I look like? What if I look silly? What if I don't look like the best leader? What if I don't do X? And in reality, it's rarely about me.
That's a huge one. I think especially for this generation and the ways in which we've kind of shaped kids with social media or with technology. I think it's really easy to...
The optics.
Yeah.
We like to end all of our conversations with a question behind our name. The Evening Rounds name was one that we were intentional about. It means something, I think, different to almost every physician I've asked this of. When you hear the concept of evening rounds, what does it mean to you?
So I think of evening rounds, and it's funny, when the literal, form of rounds. I'm an emergency physician, so I do rounds all the time, I guess, but not morning, afternoon, or evening. But what I think of evening rounds is the work of the day's been done, and you are walking around and checking in on people. It's your moment to connect, right? If you're a faculty member, it's your moment to connect with all of the learners that are in the space. It's your moment to connect with the patient to say, how are you doing? And all of these things that happened to you today, do you feel better? And what can we do to make you feel better? And rest. And then from the learner's standpoint, I think it's that moment where you stop and say, what about all that's going on here isn't clear? And that piece of letting someone know that it's okay to ask a question. But I think of that moment of, like ending the day in a place of peace and serenity. And that no matter who you are in healthcare, you need that. That's where I see evening rounds.
Well, I look forward to seeing that Rwanda sunset, because I think it's going to fit that description of what you just described. I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. I know how busy your schedule is, and so to carve out some time to join us today means a lot.
Oh, thank you. It's really been fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much.